You may have heard me mention how indignant I was that the U.S. government did not use the passions unleashed by the climate change drama which came up during the lockdown over the COVID disaster to mandate a national education dialogue and teacher retraining on an emergency basis last summer. And as a consequence of this indignation, I decided to start a class in the subject, largely in an attempt to help my sister, who only has 5 or 10 minutes now and then to watch a video like this. There's a lot of politics in there, but we need to look at the actual science and understand specifically what we mean by the issue of climate change. As a result, I'm beginning this series of classes for those who may have some interest in becoming familiar with the actual issues raised by the topic. You may realize that science applies to things other than just climate change. So what is the science that applies most to climate change? We're talking about chemistry, elements, atoms, and compounds, and understanding how they function. When you get into the science of climate change, what you're looking at isn't just the question of atomic particles, but ultimately you're looking at the question of what potential these particles have to bring on climate warming. The wavelengths where the molecule absorbs is a factor, the strength of the absorption, and the atmospheric lifetime of the particle. Some of the ones that are destructive to the atmosphere are known as greenhouse gases. We can go into the topic of greenhouse gases in some detail as we look at some of the issues that are raised, interpreting the data. But one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that the data comes from somewhere. One of the places that the data comes from is islands in the Pacific. They're up on high mountains where they can detect relatively rarefied atmosphere. Mauna Loa is one of the places. So when we look at the issues of climate change, we look at the data and the chemistry, where the greenhouse gases are coming from, if that can even be detected, what the greenhouse gases are accumulating consist of, and what the consequences for the greenhouse gases are. Now, I think you realize it's not entirely possible to avoid politics altogether. I'd like you to familiarize yourself a little with such things as the Declaration on Human Rights and Climate Change, which is a relatively large manuscript from the UN. It goes into some detail about the issue of human rights. Now, the human rights issues do not just pertain to climate change. The human rights issues that exist also pertain to many issues such as women's rights and the rights of children to an education, the freedom from slave labors, where children are used in slave labor throughout Asia, for example. Greta Thunberg, who is widely known, I admire, wrote a book called No One is Too Small to Make a Difference. The question of who speaks for the silent weak. It's important to understand because it's a hot political topic in climate change. I personally don't want to get dragged into race war ecology. People who deny climate have a lot to say, but it's a wall of sound. They don't have any information behind it. You need to study the climate change. People who believe in, that white is evil and out to get the black man have a lot to say too. But climate change doesn't discriminate. It may seem to, when you realize that the poor countries who produce the least in terms of fossil fuel emissions are the people who are suffering the most. But when you look at the issues of climate change from the point of view of what are known as hot topics, you need to evaluate information scientifically in the context of these issues for it to be relevant to climate change. If you look at the issue of sensitivity and sensibility for the silent weak, the poor children, Vanessa Nakate, a friend of Greta Thunberg, said quite quotably and understandably, "You can't adapt to starvation." Children who are starving are not the only problem at the root of sensitivity for the interconnectedness of things. Ocean acidification, the ocean absorbs, it's a carbon sink, but it turns some of this carbon into carbonic acid. And the proportion of carbonic acid then starts to eat at the root of the food chain. It dissolves the shells of fish in the ocean. So when we look at ocean acidification and we look at starvation, we're seeing the interconnectedness of things. And it's not an interconnectedness that can necessarily be solved by politics if we don't have knowledge about what's happened. But there are things going on in the climate change adaptation scene which are very heartbreaking and heartrending, but also have a lot of heart about them. There's a tribal planning framework about climate change adaptation strategies, one of which issue is how to save and rescue the elderly who are caught in wildfires. This is an important contribution to our understanding of how to mitigate by coming to maximize the potentials of telecommunications, which is what this video series is all about. After all, my indignation that the president didn't authorize this last summer as a nationwide vocational training for teachers. When you look at the sub-issues of botany and climate change, you find such things as ethnobotany. I've studied minorities, and minorities will certainly come up, and advocacy for minorities will certainly come up in the course of this lecture. And there's certainly nothing wrong with advocacy for a particular minority if that's your hobby and your interest. I did a bibliography on Native American climate change mitigation efforts, which relied very heavily on the science of the IPCC, about which the Native Americans are very well aware. So, at root, we're talking about the chemical principles that determine whether a liquid is base or acidic, and thus the effect of accumulating carbon on the ocean and its ability to support life, the diversity of life. We're going into mass extinctions. We're losing whole species of life on this planet. We examine the role of photosynthesis in aquatic plants and affecting the pH of water. Apply biological principles to global energy use issues. Demonstrate knowledge of safe laboratory practices and reproducing experiments that help us to verify the hypothesis that there are problems with acidification in the ocean. Gather and critically evaluate experimental evidence and draw appropriate conclusions from observations and empirical data. So my point, and the point on which I will rest here, is that understanding climate change is a field of scientific knowledge that is accessible to people on the freshman level. Teachers can be retrained to understand it and put it in the context of modern political dialogue.